In quiet suburbs, beneath the calm of trimmed hedges and HOA newsletters, some battles are louder than they seem. This isn't a story about weeds and fences. It's about power. About one man, his garden, and the neighbor who declared war over a shortcut, and underestimated just how far he'd go to protect what was his. You see, in Willow Creek, things used to be simple. But when Darla Simmons decided that her rules outweighed everyone else's rights, she didn't just step on the flowers. She stepped on a community's patience. What started with crushed basil would soon unravel a system, and it all began with one stubborn gardener and a patch of poison ivy. Miles Granger wasn't looking for trouble. At 63, he'd traded the stress of architectural deadlines for sunrises, compost, and the quiet rhythm of tending soil. His modest home sat at the edge of Willow Creek, a meticulously maintained neighborhood nestled against a grove of old pine trees in Colorado. His yard wasn't just grass and flowers. It was memory, healing, a place where grief finally had somewhere to settle after losing his wife 3 years prior. Most mornings, Miles rose before the birds, made a pot of dark roast, and stepped barefoot into his backyard garden. He'd listen to the wind brushing through the leaves, check the snapdragons for pests, and talk to the tomatoes like old friends. His garden wasn't perfect, but it was his, and it gave him a purpose. That summer, his 14-year-old grandson, Theo, came to stay for a few months. His parents were going through a divorce, and the boy needed space to breathe, to disconnect, to recalibrate. Gardening wasn't his thing at first, but after a few weeks, Theo started waking up early too, pulling weeds, asking questions about soil pH, and learning to distinguish between basil and mint by scent alone. Miles was proud. He didn't say it much, but watching Theo bloom in the garden felt like redemption for them both. Willow Creek itself was mostly peaceful, mostly. But every neighborhood had its queen bee, and here, her name was Darla Simmons. She was the self-appointed ruler of the HOA, having somehow bullied and charmed her way into the top position over the past decade. Darla was the kind of woman who could recite zoning regulations faster than most, could list their grandkids' names. To her, the HOA wasn't a system for order. It was a kingdom, and she ruled it with a passive-aggressive iron fist. At first, Darla and Miles had a relatively civil relationship. She welcomed him when he moved in, brought him a pie, complimented his fence, but things soured the moment she started using his backyard as her personal shortcut to the neighborhood tennis courts. It started subtly, a flash of floral print through the trees, the rustle of her sequined flip-flops disturbing mulch. Then, more brazenly, walking her dog straight through his garden beds, trampling lettuce, and never once apologizing. When Miles finally confronted her, gently, reasonably, Darla had simply laughed. "Oh, Miles, don't be so fussy. I've been using this path for years. It saves me a full 5-minute walk around. Besides, it's just plants." He'd stared at her, stunned. "It's private property." She patted his arm like he was a child. Yes, but this is a community. We all share, don't we?" From that moment on, Miles understood. To Darla, community only meant one thing: her convenience. He tried to handle it like an adult. He installed a simple wooden sign that read, "Private garden, please do not enter." Mama disappeared within a week. He put up a decorative trellis. Darla snapped it in two. He even tried appealing to the HOA formally, submitting a complaint with photos, dates, and polite language. But when the reply came back, it wasn't what he expected. "Dear Mr. Granger, after reviewing the situation, the HOA has determined that while personal property rights are important, community harmony is paramount. Residents are encouraged to resolve minor disputes without formal intervention." Willow Creek HOA. It was signed by Darla herself. Miles felt something simmer in his chest that day. Not rage, not yet, but a slow, grinding erosion of faith. Faith in rules, in neighbors, in fairness. Still, he didn't lash out. He doubled down on his garden. That summer, he and Theo planted sunflowers along the border, and Miles hoped they'd be enough of a barrier. Soft, beautiful, symbolic. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was 6:07 a.m. Miles stood on the porch, coffee in hand, admiring the golden hue stretching across the yard. He heard the screen door creak. Theo joined him, groggy, but curious. "Morning," Miles said. Theo yawned. "Morning, who's that?" Miles squinted toward the far end of the yard. It was Darla, in her usual bathrobe, stomping through the sunflowers like they were weeds, a watering can in one hand, a tennis racket in the other. But something was different this time. She was screaming. "You think you can fence me in?" she shrieked, flinging the watering can at a tomato cage. "This isn't a prison yard, Miles!" Theo's jaw dropped. Is this normal?" "No," Miles muttered. "This is escalation." They watched, stunned, as Darla kicked over a pot of herbs, ripped a marigold from the ground, and stormed through the garden like a woman possessed. Miles sat down his cup and stepped forward. "Darla, that's enough." She turned, eyes wide, face red. "I will not be trapped like a rat. This land isn't just yours. I have rights." "You're trespassing," he said calmly. "Again. And now you're destroying property. In front of a witness." That made her pause. Theo had taken out his phone and was already recording. Darla's voice lowered. "You wouldn't dare." Miles stepped forward, heart pounding. "Try me." For a moment, silence stretched between them like taut wire. Then, Darla turned sharply, stomped back through the busted flower bed, and disappeared behind the shrubs. Theo looked at his grandfather. "What now?" Miles exhaled slowly. "Now. Now we stop playing nice." And with that, the war began. Miles wasn't a man who liked conflict. He built things for a living, not tore them down. But after Darla's tantrum in his garden, something changed. Maybe it was the look on Theo's face, that mix of confusion and quiet anger. Or maybe it was the marigolds, ripped from their beds like they were worthless. Either way, Miles realized something important. Logic would never win with someone like Darla. She didn't respect boundaries. She didn't care about rules unless they benefited her. So, if he couldn't reason with her, maybe it was time to adapt. The next morning, Miles woke up early and took his coffee out to the shed. By the time Theo joined him outside, he was already elbow-deep in a pile of soil and thorny green stems. "Grandpa, what are you planting?" Theo asked, raising an eyebrow. Miles gave a small smile. "Insurance." It wasn't technically illegal to grow native plants, so long as they weren't invasive. And stinging nettle? Oh, it was native. Very native. And highly uncomfortable if you brushed up against it the wrong way. Together, they lined the shortcut with a dense row of greenery. It looked innocuous, just another part of the garden to anyone who didn't know better. But Miles was meticulous. He left a small path through the nettles for Theo and himself, cleverly hidden with stepping stones and trimmed brush. Theo was skeptical at first. "Isn't this kind of sneaky?" Miles smirked. "It's defensive landscaping." By the third day, Darla returned. Of course she did. But this time, she wasn't shouting. She was humming, confident. Carrying a smoothie in one hand, phone in the other, she strolled right into the new hedge, like it owed her rent. The scream that followed echoed down the entire street. "Oh, my legs, what is this?" From the porch, Miles sipped his coffee. Theo, recording from the bushes, couldn't contain a chuckle. Darla came stumbling back through the yard, arms flailing, legs blotched red with angry rashes. She looked like she'd rolled through a field of fire ants. "You put poison in your garden!" she shrieked from the sidewalk. Miles raised his voice, calm and neighborly. "It's stinging nettle, completely legal, native plant. You'll want some antihistamine." Darla's eyes bulged. "I'm reporting this to the HOA." Miles shrugged. Feel free. I already submitted an update to my garden layout for the record, with photos. Her face twisted like she'd bitten into a lemon, but she wasn't done. That afternoon, Miles received a knock on the door. It was Don Burwell, the HOA secretary, a man who always smelled faintly of printer ink and anxiety. "Mr. Granger," Don said, shuffling his papers, "we've received a formal complaint regarding hazardous foliage on your property." Miles gestured to the porch. "Care to come sit a spell?" Don hesitated, but sat. Theo handed him a printout of the HOA's own landscaping guidelines, with highlighted passages regarding native plants, resident autonomy, and non-toxic flora. Don blinked at it, clearly confused. "She walked through a marked, fenced private yard," Miles explained patiently. "The plants never left my property. She did." Don sighed. "Well, technically you're not in violation, but Darla is persuasive." "I'm not afraid of persuasive," Miles said. "But I am tired of being polite while my rights get stomped on. Literally." Don gave a sheepish nod and left without incident. The next day, Miles and Theo upgraded. They installed motion-triggered sprinklers. Nothing crazy, just enough to startle. They added a decorative archway labeled Private Path, monitored. Theo even set up an alert system using a repurposed doorbell cam. When Darla stepped foot on the path, Miles would get a ping on his phone. They didn't have to wait long. Darla came again, dressed like she was going on safari, khaki hat, oversized sunglasses, socks pulled up to her knees. But the moment she crossed the invisible line, the sprinklers hissed to life, spraying a sharp mist of cold water. She let out a startled yelp, tripped over a garden hose, and landed squarely in the herbs. Theo, filming from behind a bush, whispered, "We're going viral." But that wasn't the goal. Miles didn't want humiliation. He wanted peace. He wanted his grandson to learn that you didn't have to shout to be heard. That justice didn't always roar. It could whisper, quietly, persistently, until even the most stubborn neighbor had to listen. But Darla didn't listen. She plotted. And somewhere behind her red splotched skin and gritted teeth, a new idea was forming. One that would turn Miles's quiet rebellion into an all-out siege. But for now, Miles stood at the edge of his garden, arms crossed, and said to no one in particular, "Round 1, Garden 1, Darla 0. He didn't know it yet, but the next round would cost him more than a few crushed flowers. It would test every ounce of resolve he had, and it would expose just how far some people were willing to go, to not lose. For 3 blissful days, the neighborhood was silent. No stomping, no screaming, no passive-aggressive notes in Miles's mailbox. It was so peaceful that even Theo remarked, "Is she done?" Miles wasn't convinced. Darla Simmons doesn't quit. She recalibrates. And just as he predicted, on the morning of the 4th day, a letter arrived. Thick envelope, HOA seal, delivered by hand. Theo hovered over his shoulder as Miles slid it open with a butter knife. The paper inside was so formal, it practically smelled like courtrooms and printer ink. Notice of non-compliance. Dear Mr. Granger, based on recent observations and complaints filed by multiple residents, your property is now under review for violations of community safety guidelines. Unauthorized landscaping that includes harmful vegetation, improper water usage via motion sprinklers, and aggressive behavior toward fellow residents will not be tolerated. A hearing will be scheduled to determine next steps, including potential fines or mandatory landscape modification. Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Darla Simmons, Chairwoman. Theo gawked. Wait, aggressive behavior? Miles stared at the letter, his jaw tightening. She's weaponizing the rule book. And she had backup. Over the next 48 hours, Darla launched a full-scale campaign. She started with the neighbors, door to door, clutching a clipboard like a sword. Miles spotted her chatting with Mr. and Mrs. Pruitt on Elm Lane, leaning in like a wartime conspirator. By noon, Miles noticed three other residents inspecting his yard from afar, whispering and shaking their heads. "She's painting you as the neighborhood menace," Theo said, "trying to isolate you." Miles nodded grimly. "It's classic. If she can't control me, she'll try to erase me." And then came the HOA emergency meeting. It was held at the community center. A beige room filled with uncomfortable chairs, stale coffee, and the quiet tension of people trying not to pick sides too quickly. Darla stood at the front like a general before her troops, dressed in a pastel pantsuit and pearls. The room fell quiet as she tapped her stack of documents. "Neighbors," she began, voice syrupy, "it's come to our attention that Mr. Miles Granger has repeatedly endangered the harmony of our community. Between the aggressive plants, motion-triggered water traps, and surveillance, many residents no longer feel safe walking past his yard." Miles raised a hand. "No one's been harmed. The only person walking through my yard was you." Darla didn't flinch. "I represent the collective, and I've gathered 12 formal complaints. That's enough for disciplinary review." "Filed by who?" Miles asked. "Your book club?" Scattered chuckles broke out. Darla's smile tightened. "You may think this is funny, Mr. Granger, but your refusal to cooperate is why we're here. You've turned a peaceful community into a war zone." Miles stood slowly, not angrily, calm but firm. "No, Darla. You walked into my property without permission, over and over. You tore out my trellis. You picked my vegetables. You mocked my signs. And when I didn't fight back, you escalated." He pulled a folder from his bag and opened it on the table. Inside were high-definition printouts, images from the motion cameras. Darla mid-trespass. Darla destroying flowers. Darla screaming, watering can in hand. A low murmur rolled through the crowd. "And when I finally defended my space," Miles continued, "you tried to twist the rules. But this isn't about a few plants. It's about control. And I won't apologize for protecting my home." The room fell silent. Even Don from the HOA blinked like he'd just woken from a trance. Darla opened her mouth to reply, but this time there was no applause. No gasps of sympathy. Just uncomfortable shifting. Someone cleared their throat. Mrs. Olstein, from 3 doors down, stood up. "I don't agree with poison plants, but I also don't walk through other people's yards." Darla spun. "So you're saying it's okay to plant hazards?" "No," said another neighbor. "But it's worse to lie and pretend you're the victim when you've been stomping on someone's daisies for months." More voices chimed in. The tide was turning, and Darla knew it. She straightened her papers, clamped her jaw shut, and gave Miles a death glare that could have curdled milk. But she didn't say another word. The HOA board announced a temporary suspension of any disciplinary action pending further review. Miles was allowed to keep his garden as is, so long as no proven harm was caused. Darla left the room like a queen deposed, shoulders stiff, heels clicking like war drums. Theo looked up at Miles as they walked to the truck. "That was incredible," he said. "You didn't even yell." Miles smiled. "You don't win wars with volume. You win with truth, patience, and documentation." They drove home in silence, but Miles could feel the storm wasn't over. Darla would regroup. She always did. But for the first time in weeks, he wasn't alone. The neighborhood had seen through her. The real fight was still ahead, but now the garden had allies. The days that followed the HOA meeting were strangely quiet. Too quiet. Miles knew better than to believe it was over. Darla Simmons wasn't the kind of woman who backed down after a public embarrassment. No. When people like her lost control, they didn't retreat. They reloaded. And reload she did. On a gray Thursday morning, Miles stepped outside with his coffee, ready to tend his newly planted flower bed. What he saw instead made his chest go tight. His garden was gone, flattened, ripped apart, every bush and bloom, every carefully laid stone and trellis obliterated. The beds had been trampled, the fencing uprooted, poison ivy gone, nettles shredded. His archway smashed in two, a massacre in the soil. It looked like a landscaping crew had declared war in the dead of night. He stood frozen, mug trembling in his hands. Theo came out moments later, and the silence between them said it all. "Was it her?" Theo asked softly. Miles didn't answer. He just walked forward, kneeling beside a crushed violet stem, brushing the broken petals with a kind of grief that had no words. It felt personal. Not just an attack on a garden, but on him. On everything he had quietly built to protect his space, his peace, his dignity. But when he checked his cameras, every single one of them had gone dark. Cut wires. The security footage was gone. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. And Miles had a damn good guess who gave the order. He marched to Darla's house. She opened the door as if she'd been waiting. Robe, coffee, smirk. "Oh, good morning, Miles. Lovely weather, isn't it?" Miles stared at her. "What did you do?" Her eyes sparkled with false innocence. "Me? Why, nothing. Though I did notice your yard's looking a little overgrown. Shame what happens when things aren't properly maintained." He clenched his fists. "You destroyed it." She sipped her coffee. "If you can't prove it, it didn't happen." And there it was, the line that turned Miles's stomach. She was daring him to lose control, but he didn't. He turned, walked back to his porch, and sat down. Theo followed. "You're just gonna let this go?" the boy asked, voice shaky with anger. "She ruined everything you worked for." Miles stared out at the wreckage. "No, but I'm not going to give her the reaction she wants." Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He called his lawyer. The legal path was slower, but sharper. He filed for property destruction and trespassing. With a neighbor's doorbell camera, they found footage of an unmarked landscaping truck arriving around 3 a.m. Not enough for criminal charges, but enough to implicate. Then came the paper trail. Miles submitted a civil suit with damage estimates, camera repair bills, landscaping invoices, and sworn testimony from 3 neighbors who heard strange activity that night. The total? Over $18,000 in damages. But the most powerful part wasn't the paperwork. It was the community. Because Miles wasn't the only one Darla had crossed, people began coming forward. Mrs. Langley, 2 streets over, revealed that Darla had complained about her mailbox for being too whimsical. The Jennings couple shared how Darla tried to fine them for putting up Christmas lights before Thanksgiving. For years, she'd used her power to enforce rules selectively, punish dissent, and manipulate votes in the HOA board. Now, with the community's eyes wide open, those stories carried weight. The final blow came from a retired judge who had recently moved into the neighborhood, quiet, polite, unassuming. She attended a community forum where Miles calmly presented his case. When it was over, the judge stood and said, "In 30 years on the bench, I've rarely seen such a blatant abuse of authority by a community leader. This man was targeted, and you all watched it happen." The room went still. Darla's control cracked visibly. And that night, Miles stood once again on his ruined lawn. Nothing left but dirt and roots. But this time, he didn't feel alone. He felt the neighborhood shifting. He felt momentum. But as he looked to the wreckage, he also felt a cold realization. Darla had gone this far over garden plants. What would she do when her reputation, her power, and her throne were really on the line? The war wasn't over, but the battle lines had moved, and Miles was done fighting alone. The next Saturday, something unprecedented happened on Willow Creek Lane. It started small. A neighbor, Mrs. Langley, set up a folding table in her front yard with a hand-painted sign that read, "Community coffee, let's talk." Miles watched from his porch as more chairs appeared. Then came baked goods. Within an hour, A dozen residents had gathered under a shady elm tree, holding paper cups and speaking in low, cautious tones. Theo came running to Miles. "Grandpa, they're talking about what happened to your garden. They're actually on your side." Miles set his mug down and stood. He hadn't asked for this, but something in him told him this wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about all of them. When he arrived, conversations quieted. Then Mrs. Langley stood up and waved him forward. "Miles," she said gently, "we're sorry. Most of us didn't realize how far Darla had gone, but we do now." Miles nodded. "I appreciate that, truly. But it's not just me. I think a lot of us have been walking on eggshells for too long." That opened the floodgates. Mr. Jennings, voice heavy with regret, admitted Darla had threatened to fine him over a backyard grill after he'd refused to vote for her re-election. The Nguyen family revealed Darla had told them their flagpole wasn't in the aesthetic guidelines, though those guidelines didn't exist in writing. Even Don Burwell from the HOA board showed up, unshaven, his shirt untucked, and confessed he'd tried to resign twice, but Darla had talked him out of it. "She uses the bylaws like weapons," he muttered, "and none of us had the guts to push back." But now they did. By Monday, the community had drafted an emergency special session request, a procedural tool in the HOA bylaws Darla herself had inserted years ago, never expecting it would be used against her. If 30% of homeowners signed it, they could force a vote of no confidence. Within 2 days, over 70% had. Darla knew, and she was unraveling. She tried to hold a press conference at her front lawn, complete with a banner that read, "Keep order, keep Darla." But only a handful of confused neighbors attended, and one teenager live-streamed the whole thing with the caption, "HOA Karen versus the world." The community was no longer whispering. They were roaring. And at the heart of it was Miles, not leading it, but symbolizing something bigger, that quiet defiance. That moment when the line is drawn and the bully realizes the crowd isn't behind them anymore. Theo watched it all with wide eyes. "You didn't even fight her directly," he said, amazed. Miles smiled. "I just stopped letting her win." When the HOA emergency meeting arrived, the rec center was packed. Dozens of chairs were filled. More stood at the back. Even the county observer, usually assigned to financial audits, was present, scribbling furiously. Darla took the podium first. Her voice was tired, her smile brittle. "I've served this community for 10 years. I've kept our values, our order, and I'm being punished for protecting that." A few polite claps, but not many. Miles didn't speak. He didn't need to. The paperwork, the pictures, the testimonies, already submitted. Instead, he sat beside Theo, watching the unraveling. The vote was anonymous, but the result was loud. 82% voted to remove Darla Simmons from the HOA board, effective immediately. The room exhaled. For the first time in years, a silence fell, not from fear, but from relief. Darla stood there, still holding her speech notes, unable to move. Then she left, head down, heels silent on the tile floor. Outside, someone had chalked onto the sidewalk. "Peace begins when control ends." Miles turned to Theo. "Come on, we've got work to do." "Replanting?" Theo asked. Miles smiled. "Rebuilding." Spring arrived like a deep breath after a long-held silence. 3 weeks had passed since the vote removed Darla Simmons from the HOA board, and her departure had left more than just a power vacuum. It left space. Space for people to speak up, for neighbors to reconnect, and for the community to heal. Miles Granger's yard, once a battlefield, had become the heart of that transformation. It started with a simple sign posted on his gate. "Saturday, replanting day, all welcome." At first, he wasn't sure if anyone would show up, but at 8:30 sharp, the first car rolled in. Then another, and another. By 9 a.m., nearly 2 dozen neighbors stood in his yard, holding shovels, seedlings, and smiles, that hadn't been seen in years. Mrs. Langley brought heirloom tomatoes. The Nguyen twins carried trays of herbs. The Jennings family donated a brand new trellis and bags of fresh mulch. Even Don Burwell came, pushing a wheelbarrow of stone pavers, his HOA name tag finally removed from his chest. Miles stood in the middle of it all, quietly overwhelmed. He looked down at Theo, who wore gloves 2 sizes too big, but held a potted lavender plant with immense pride. "Is this what you wanted, Grandpa?" Theo asked. Miles took a slow breath, heart full. "It's more than I ever hoped for." The garden came alive again, not just with plants, but with stories. As people dug and planted, they shared things they'd kept to themselves for too long. Frustration with how they'd been silenced, guilt over not standing up sooner, hopes that maybe, just maybe, this could be a fresh start. The air was rich with the scent of soil, wildflowers, and second chances. By the afternoon, the yard had transformed. New beds, rebuilt fences, an arched trellis wrapped in morning glories. A wide stone path that curved around the flower beds, inviting anyone to walk and admire. Not trespass, but admire. And at the edge of it all, Theo placed a handmade wooden sign. Burned into the wood with careful letters were the words, "Miles's Garden, protected by love, rebuilt by community." Miles knelt beside the boy, eyes stinging. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. That night, the porch lights flickered on as people stayed to share dinner, picnic tables filled with baked dishes, lemonade, stories, and laughter. Someone strummed a guitar. Kids ran barefoot in the grass. And in the golden hour light, Miles saw not just a garden restored, but a neighborhood reborn. As for Darla Simmons, she sold her house quietly and moved away. No fanfare, no goodbye. Rumor had it, she tried to run for a local position in another neighborhood. But the story of what happened in Willow Creek had already spread, shared through online forums, community newsletters, even a local radio feature titled "The Garden That Refused to Die." Her name had become less of a threat and more of a warning. A month later, the new HOA board, led by a rotating team of actual volunteers, voted to institute a new policy. No community leader may serve more than 2 consecutive terms. Complaints must be verified by a third party before action. All HOA decisions must be accessible and open for public review. They called it the Granger Clause. Miles laughed when he read it. He hadn't wanted any recognition. He just wanted to be left in peace. But what he got instead was something much deeper. Respect, support, and roots, stronger than any fence. On a quiet Sunday morning, Miles sat once again on his porch, mug in hand. Theo snuggled beside him, sketchbook in lap. The garden buzzed softly with bees, wind, and life. "Do you think it'll happen again?" Theo asked. "Someone trying to take over?" Miles took a sip of coffee and nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe. But now we know how to fight back. And we know we don't have to fight alone." Theo smiled, then added a tiny drawing of a sunflower beside the sign on his sketch. And for the first time in a long, long time, the air didn't smell like conflict or control. It smelled like lavender, like home, like freedom.